for the ANTaR Campaigns and Advocacy Council National Forum, which is something we do every year, a public part of the ANTaR National Forum. So welcome to everyone. Just to give you a bit of a step through of the program that we're doing. Basically, one of our board members, Des Rogers, will be giving a welcome to country. Paul, our national director, will be giving us a bit of a run through about ANTaR's activities for this year. And then we'll be getting Damian to speak on from the First Peoples Disability Network. And we'll have a Q&A for about 20 minutes and then a bit of a close. So we'll see how we go, but just want to welcome you all and just move quickly to Des Rogers, who is one of our board members, to do the acknowledgement. And I guess on where he is, I know he's not in his own country. I'll get Des to do an acknowledgement of country. Des Rogers is a Southern Arenti man of the Potami clan from Central Australia and has resided in many places, Alice Springs, Brisbane, and I know when I met him, he was in Melbourne, I think working for Aboriginal Housing, from memory. He's from founding an Aboriginal business incubator, mentoring youth in Alice Springs in response to culturally appropriate skills and development and economic opportunities and needs in the community for a period of 15 years and has continued to be a mentor to many people. He's a high skilled executive leader with extensive board membership in not-for-profit and public sectors, and as well as being on the board of ANTaR, and I think you're on the board of Oxfam as well. He's on the board of the Murray Watch and is currently senior role at Murdy Pucky at Cobar, New South Wales. So over to you, Des.
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and hello, or Wooda in my language, which is Southern Aranda. To everyone on this link, and especially Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, I also want to acknowledge all peoples from all nations across the nation and across the oceans. I want to make a special acknowledgement to Jamie Lowe, who's on Surrey business, and welcome to Damian Griffis. Welcome, brother. It is ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to deliver the acknowledgement to country, and I feel honoured. This is a very important task. It is one of the important cultural protocols to acknowledge and pay respects to our traditional owners and the guardians on the country where we meet. I pay my respects to the Nimar people for today in Cobar, in far western New South Wales. But I also pay my respects to all of the clans of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the nation. We thank them for allowing us to walk softly in their ancestors' footprints. We tread lightly on the traditional homelands, which they looked after for thousands of years. It is through their continuation of culture, ceremonies, cultural practices, stories, songs, and dances that they have maintained the cultural and spiritual integrity on this land. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to elders both past, present, and those who will lead us into the future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Australia's first people. Ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you all to take the time to talk to your Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and to find out the important and significant history of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in your area where you work and live, as this understanding is crucial to the work that we undertake as employees and must be taken seriously by all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Des. Sorry, I'm just checking if I'm on mute. I'm not. Thanks very much, Des, for that acknowledgement of country. And just to let people know, I'm here on the land of the Wurundjeri people. I've actually got in front of my house, which is where I'm zooming from, one of the very first Aboriginal acknowledgement plaques when I did some work with Richard Franklin in the long past, in the late 90s, when he was head of Mirrabee Nations and organised acknowledgement plaques, which they basically promoted, and I think one of the first ones that was done in Australia. So yeah, coming here from Wurundjeri country, from Nam. I want to now introduce Damian Griffis, who has, as Des was saying, is filling in for Jamie Rowe, who has sorry business to attend to. Damian is the CEO of the First Peoples Disability Network, a descendant of the Warrami people, a leading advocate for human rights for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with a disability. Damian has been a central figure in the establishment of both the Disability Network New South Wales and the national organisation. And he represents First Nations Disability Network at regional, national, international forums. And in 2014, he won the Tony Fitzgerald Memorial Award at the Australian Human Rights Awards. So I've known Damian for quite a while, both at Oxfam and when I was at Snake. And Damian's been a pretty mighty champion in terms of the work that needs to happen for First Peoples around First Peoples disability, and has done tremendous work. And the organisation, of course, has been involved with the Royal Commission and has ensured that First Nations views are being attended to by that commission. So it's great to see you, Damian. I don't think I've seen you for about 2 or 3 years. Yeah. So welcome to this webinar, and over to you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks Uncle Des for your acknowledgement, and thanks Paul and everyone at ANTaR for the opportunity today. I'd like to add my acknowledgement, acknowledging elders past, present and emerging. I'm speaking to you today from Awabakal and Warramai country in Newcastle. I'd also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge 2 of our founding elders, Uncle Lester Bostock, great Bundjalung warrior, and Auntie Gail Rankin, Nunanjeri woman. Both were leaders with physical disability who we lost in recent times, and we acknowledge them as our founding elders. This afternoon, I plan to talk a bit about who we are at the First Peoples Disability Network, but also talk a bit about the lived experience of First Peoples with disability across the country, and also talk a bit about what the Disability Royal Commission is doing in terms of investigating the situation for First Nations people with disability. So just a bit about the First Peoples Disability Network. We can actually trace our origins to a gathering of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability that was held in Alice Springs back in 1999. At that gathering, every jurisdiction sent a male and female First Nations person with disability. And there was a number of recommendations that were made as a consequence of that gathering. And one of those was for people to go back to their state-based, states and set up state-based networks of and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability. So myself and Uncle Lester Bostock back in the year 2000 established the Aboriginal Disability Network New South Wales. We did that by holding a gathering of Aboriginal people with disability from around New South Wales, and at that gathering a committee of First Nations or Aboriginal people with disability was elected. Then in 2002 to 2005, we travelled around the state of New South Wales, meeting directly with First Nations people with disability and their families. We weren't so interested in talking to the service system as such. We wanted to hear directly from people about their situation. And as you could imagine, that raised any number of very serious human rights abuses across a range of areas. So that included very serious discrimination in the areas of education, employment, interactions with police, access to housing, all very serious areas of concern for First Nations people with disability across New South Wales. And we wrote a report called Telling It Like It Is, which is still often referred to as the first real report based on direct consultations with First Nations people with disability. You can still access copies of that report through our website. Meanwhile, in other states, there wasn't much opportunity for progress. With the end of ATSIC, a lot of opportunity to grow other networks disappeared, unfortunately. There was a network of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability in Queensland that was run by some volunteers. There was a South Australian committee of Aboriginal people with disability who provided advice to the South Australian government, but not much happening in other jurisdictions, sadly. So it wasn't until 2007 when we saw a change of government in Canberra that Uncle Lester and myself went down and saw the then Parliamentary Secretary for Disabilities, Bill Shorten, and he provided a small grant to the New South Wales network to grow the national body again. So over the next sort of few years, we had a number of gatherings of First Nations people with disability. We'd met leaders from the community around the country over the previous years, and we brought everyone together to establish the First Peoples Disability Network. Very unique organisation domestically, but also it turns out internationally actually, in that our board is made up of First Nations people that have disability themselves. So every one of our board members either has physical disability, intellectual disability, acquired brain injury, psychosocial disability across the disability spectrum. And every one of our staff, we started very small. We just had one employee for a long time, myself, and then we grew gradually over time. We weren't always very successful in getting funding, probably because we were pretty outspoken, to be honest, about the failures of government and even the non-government system, really, to even recognise the needs of First Nations people with disability. But over time, we've grown gradually, and we now have 9 full-time staff and a number of part-time staff around the country. Every one of our staff has disability themselves or a very close personal association to disability. For myself, I spent a lot of time around a profoundly hearing impaired grandmother, and I've also had my own struggles with mental health over the years. Every one of our staff has a similar story, either disability themselves or a very close association. So that makes us very unique in an Australian context, because we are the only what would be technically referred to as an Indigenous disabled people's organisation. And it turns out there really isn't anyone like us anywhere, actually. So even Maori mob have some diagnostic focused disability groups. North American traditional owners have, again, some regional bodies, but nothing like what we do here in terms of a national focus. So we also, in terms of some of the history of the disability rights movement more generally in Australia, and I think it's sometimes helpful to people to understand this history, that in many ways, what happened when the English invaded was they brought with them a perception or an attitude around disability that was put into place very, very quickly. So some of the first buildings built in Sydney and Parramatta, for that matter, were often institutions. So orphanages, or very unfortunate terms of the day, like idiot houses and asylums, were very quickly built in Australia. And you see a lot of them still around today. I'm probably more familiar with Sydney, but some of the famous disability institutions in Sydney are often on some of the most prime pieces of real estate. So the Western idea of disability then was to lock people up, basically. So you put people either in institutions on top of hills or next to rivers, so they couldn't escape, basically. And that's where a lot of the institutions today still exist, in very secretive places. But this sort of Western approach of locking people away, removing them from society, was immediately in impact. Now, this is in conflict with the First Peoples, First Nations perspective of disability. And we know that now because there's more and more evidence, anthropological evidence, that shows that disability has always been an accepted part of the human experience from a First Nations perspective. And that's something we should be very proud of. And we know that from a few reasons. Firstly, there was no comparable word. There is no comparable word to disability in traditional languages. So that would suggest that it was an accepted part of the human experience. Labeling is very much a Western concept. And for those of us who move in the disability sector, there's hardly more heavily labelled area than disability. You could be autistic, acquired brain injury, cerebral palsy, intellectual disability, psychosocial disability, mental health, you name it. There's a long list of labels that people are given in the disability sector. But in traditional and in community life, amongst First Nations communities, disability was often described in what's an appropriate way, more an impairment-based way. So brother there's a bit slower than everyone else, cousin doesn't hear too well, uncle has a bit of trouble moving around, not said in a way that's negative. It's more about that's what we need to think about to ensure that that community member can participate in our community life. And more recently, we've had some really amazing discoveries at Lake Mungo, where there's been a fairly recent discovery of a single footprint of a male person dated at, I think it's now dated at 25,000 years ago. So it appears to be a single footprint and a stick in the ground. But also, interestingly, the theory is that the male person was moving at great speed, is the theory. So obviously that one-legged male person was participating in community life. In fact, the theory is he was participating in a hunt. So that again shows that disability was an accepted part of the human experience. There's also a lot of evidence that shows that First Nation people who are blind were often traditional healers. And there's also more evidence now to show that there's been long existence of sign languages, form of sign languages for a very long time. That's a slightly romantic view. It's not to say that there aren't very significant challenges. When the missionaries arrived, they often brought with them too another story around disability, which was about sin and also notions of bad karma or concepts that, you know, related to perhaps the way disability was described in the Bible, for instance. So really at the point of contact, there was immediate conflict between a Western view of disability and a First Nations, First Peoples view of disability. And we're probably still seeing that play out in many ways. So the Western approach of locking people away was something that was in practice, well, it's still in practice, actually. It wasn't until we saw the world wars and soldiers returning who were often injured, very seriously injured, that disability rights started to take off a bit more. So you had soldiers coming back who perhaps were amputees or blind or whatever it might be, and they then grew a social movement of Australians with disability out of that. Probably only in the last 20 years have First Nations people with disability started to develop their own voice in relation to the wider movement. So in terms of some really key issues facing, or some facts around disability in our communities, the 2019 census said that 45% of all First Nations people have some form of disability or long-term health condition. The Australian figure is 19% of all Australians can be considered people living with disability. So the rate is twice that, at least twice the prevalence. But what's actually a concern is that's actually considered a conservative figure, because we actually don't have a measure on the prevalence of what's referred to today as psychosocial disability. So a lot of us on the call today, I'm sure, would know that you'd be pretty exceptional as a First Nations person not to have experienced depression or anxiety or PTSD at some point in your life in many ways. So we don't really have a measure of that. We also have very high rates of severe and profound disability. So 7.7% of all First Nations people can be considered to be severely or profoundly disabled. And that's the people that should be getting access to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We probably won't get an opportunity to talk about that today, but generally speaking, the National Disability Insurance Scheme is not meeting need, not even getting close. And there's a whole lot of work that needs to happen around that to change that situation. Having said that, though, there's actually still high rates of unreported disability. Where we've seen that most recently, and we come across that a lot, we've done some work at the Koori Court in Parramatta in the past, because the magistrate asked us to come along and provide some advice. The magistrate was saying to us that she reckoned out of the 4 or 5 matters she heard every Friday, that easily half of the young Koori kids at Koori Court had some form of disability, often undiagnosed. So might be acquired brain injury, because there's now research that shows that 25% of young Koori kids in juvenile detention have been knocked out in the previous 6 months, knocked out to the point of a serious potential brain injury. Or there are situations where the young person may have psychosocial disability, for example. The other thing that's really important to note that sort of complicates things a little bit is most First Nations people with disability don't tend to self-identify as people with disability. And this presents a problem when it comes to accessing things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Now, the reasons for that are often because, firstly, a lot of our members would say that why would I want to take on another perceived negative label if I already experienced discrimination based on my Aboriginality? That's definitely a factor. A big factor too is parents are often very reluctant to come forward and ask for help if they have a young child with disability. And we're seeing those stories play out really traumatically, to be honest, this week at the Disability Royal Commission, where the risk of having your child removed is very, very real, as we all know. And if you add a dimension of disability to it, that risk becomes even more of a problem. And then we have new emerging disability types like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Now, having said all this, I don't want to present a gloomy picture here, because I want to get to the point of what we're trying to change here, because we would say that we're actually the thought leaders on inclusion. So despite the high prevalence, generally speaking, most First Nations people with disability don't experience stigma in the community in which, when they were living in community. When they start engaging with external systems, that's when the problems start. So when you start engaging with school or any external, usually government agencies, that's when the discrimination often plays out. And we know this is true because of that issue I raised before of having no word for disability in traditional language, which is something to be very, very proud of, really, in many ways. So just in terms of how First Nations people acquire their disability, often it's because it's due to preventable health conditions. So everyone knows the stories around Aboriginal health, but they actually have a really strong disability part to it. So we all know of the high rates of diabetes, for example, but diabetes can lead to amputation, can lead to vision problems, for example. So often people have a very significant disability. They're likely to have experienced multiple barriers. Very few of our members around the country, it's sad to report, are in employment. In fact, Australia more generally rates as one of the worst in the OECD, so the richest countries in the world, in terms of employment of any Australian with disability. So you add our community to that, it's a real problem. A lot of our young people with disability have withdrawn or not accessed an education. Often if you live in regional or remote parts of Australia and you have a significant disability, then the school might only be able to accommodate you for a day or two. So you don't get access to a full education. And we often have what's called a very dominant medical model of disability. So the medical model is basically the Western model of disability, where you lock people up. So that's still very dominant in Australia. The medical model says there's something wrong with someone, we're going to try and cure them. But most disability is permanent. So disability has always confounded the medical system, and that's why they lock it away, basically. I'm talking in really crude terms. But the modern disability rights movement talks about social model of disability. And social model of disability says it's society that creates all the barriers for people with disability, and that evidence is everywhere. Like Sydney, Newcastle, could wander down Hunter Street here in Newcastle, and then most of the shops, if you're a wheelchair user, you couldn't get into, for example, or the train stations in Sydney, only a certain number accessible, for example. So it's society that locks you out, is the thinking there. I'm happy to take questions at any time. I don't want to just be a talking head. So if anyone wants to fire any questions now, they're very welcome to. I realise I'm presenting a picture that possibly doesn't sound very positive, but I want to draw on the positive elements of what we're trying to achieve at the First Peoples Disability Network, and also, you know, appeal to every one of us to work together to make change in this area. We say that meeting the needs of First Nations people with disability is one of the most critical and urgent social justice issues in Australia today. And we would also say it's difficult to think of any more disadvantaged Australians, to be honest, than First Nations people with disability, because they face the double discrimination of disability and indigeneity. So, was there any questions there yet, or not yet, Paul? Not yet.
Sorry, mate. I was just inviting people to, as they think of them, to start putting them in the chat so Peter can run them past you when you're finished. Sorry to interrupt, mate.
No, you're right. No worries. So we also have a situation where the psychosocial impact of colonisation is not well understood, particularly in our mental health systems around the country. The best analogy I can give is I remember reading not so long ago about generations after of Holocaust survivors were exhibiting behaviours, mental health behaviours that were aligned to PTSD and anxiety behaviours, yet they weren't in the in the concentration camps. The logic, and I don't, the work of Tracy Westerman and Helen Milroy and brilliant advocates like that are starting to raise the profile of this issue and create a better understanding of it. But it still amazes me that there's still not a deep understanding within the mental health system of what happens when you're removed from country, or, you know, the river dries up and you can't spend time down there anymore, or what are the mental health consequences of colonisation, this transgenerational trauma and deep trauma, and colonisation is a direct cause of that. And then the other behaviours that sometimes can cause disability, you know, in those communities where people struggle a bit, and there's no doubt there's a clear link between, you know, drinking too much and acquired brain injury, for example, or whatever it might be. So really critical that we need to better understand those issues. Just in terms of what we do at FPDN and what our priority areas are. So we perform a few tasks. We're only a very small organisation, and I have amazing staff at FPDN, and Paul knows many of them, who are deeply committed people and work extremely hard. But we do a lot of what's referred to as systemic advocacy, a bit like what ANTaR does in many ways. We do a lot of representation to government, appearing before parliamentary inquiries, do quite a bit of media, certainly on the ABC anyway, and do quite a bit of representation to non-government bodies about how to provide better support. And we try and develop policy positions on various things, including like a 10-point plan for the successful implementation of the NDIS in our communities, which I have to report sadly is probably a 1 or 2 out of 10 in terms of how the National Disability Insurance Scheme has gone. We do research, and people would be familiar with Scott Avery. We're cousins, proudly. He doesn't always like to admit that, but yeah. So he's at University of Western Sydney now, and he's doing a great job in terms of being a researcher in this space, because there's not much research in this space. You know, if we were doing a talk today, as we all know, around Aboriginal health, there'd be many academics doing work in that area, but in disability, it's really Scotty, and that's about it. We do a lot of community engagement. So we have a attitude at FPDN that if we're sitting behind a desk, we're not doing our job. So we get out and about as much as we can. 2020 has been really strange for us, as it has been for all of us. We just haven't had the opportunity to do that as much as we'd like. But, you know, that work is really important, because we have to be informed by what's going on in community, and people need to be able to come to us to try and get some help. But there was a community workshop we ran in Taree last week, and, young First Nations kids with disability being handcuffed and put in the back of paddy wagons and all these sort of things. And these stories that continue to be told, and a lot of us today know these stories, but, still deeply concerning that, not enough Australians know these stories, I think, in a way. So we do a lot. Probably a growing area of our work and is training. So, we've discovered that, we can't be all things to all people, and we can't be in every corner of the country. But the next best thing we can do is get people to learn how to speak up for themselves, understand their rights from a disability rights perspective. That's very little understanding of that around the country. So we do training on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which actually is a really good UN convention. It was actually created by people with disability, and we try and get people to learn that no, your child with disability's got every right to go to school, and all those sort of things. That's hard work, but really important work, and we've been asked to start doing that work in language too over in the Kimberley and the NT. So that's a big part of our work. And we also do what's called individual advocacy, which is a disability sort of term where you kind of try and help out any individuals with the matters they need support with. So that can range from anything. That can be, can you help me get on the disability support pension, to, my child is being locked in a classroom and they have autism, or it can be very serious matters of very serious situations in relation to police, for example. So it's very varied. It's often very complex. And I think that often the issue that we see the most of is just the poverty and the lack of opportunity to create positive change there. So just to finish, you've probably all heard of the Disability Royal Commission, and our organisation was one of the organisations that drove probably 10 years of campaigning, to be honest, to get a Disability Royal Commission up. It's a really sad thing to report, and I don't know that a lot of Australians realise this, but most Australians with disability, and certainly First Nations people with disability, abuse is a common part of life. And abuse takes many forms, as we know: physical, psychological, emotional, financial. Women with disability in Australia would say their statistics are frightening. They would say 70% of all women with disability have experienced sexual violence in some time in their lives. And people with disabilities, you can imagine, are very vulnerable. So there's some really disturbing stories that will be told and have been told of bizarre practices. In the first week of the Royal Commission, disability institutions are very, very secret places, and in some ways harder to access than prisons. But people being hosed down in groups, and bizarre practices of people, sleeping in dormitories, and but that was commonplace in Australia, and still is today. And for a lot of our people with disability, they talk about their loss of culture. So some of our members were placed in institutions from birth, and then they grew up and didn't know they were Aboriginal. And these are obviously Aboriginal people. So that's a really important story to tell too. But the Royal Commission is also about plotting a way forward that is more about inclusion. And like I said at the beginning, we're actually thought leaders on that. We know how to do inclusion because it comes natural to us. We don't walk around labelling people. We take people come as you are, and that's our greatest asset. And we actually have an opportunity, we would say, to educate the wider disability rights movement about, how to do that more effectively. I also don't want to paint this sort of really gloomy picture. I'm really conscious of that. We have some of the most extraordinary human beings that work for FPDN or are members that achieve extraordinary things. So I'm thinking of Jake Briggs, who used to work for us, who's now set up his own business. Jake's a quadriplegic, very significant disability, but a leader in his own right, and an extraordinary young man. Scott, who has completed his PhD. Scott has a cochlea, and it's very hard to complete a tertiary education when you have significant disability. And I'm not talking out of school here. For him, his days are tiring. You know, he gets to a certain part of the day and it's exhausting trying to follow what's going on. Reese Nagus, who's our board member, who has psychosocial disability, very significant psychosocial disability. When Reese is going well, he's going really well. And when he struggles, it's tough, but he's in an accommodating workplace and does some amazing things. Gurumul is a great disability story. Yami Lester from Central Australia, who was blinded by the nuclear testing in Maralinga, is another great story. John Baxter, who's a short-statured man, has done amazing things down in Victoria, but each and every one of them are so strong. And Uncle Lester and Auntie Gar were two extraordinary people who, despite very significant disability, were leaders in the wider Aboriginal rights movement. Uncle Lester was there when the 10 Embassy was established in Canberra with his wooden leg, and he was an extraordinary leader in his own right. So, but we really, just to finish off, we really need partners, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity, Peter, Paul and Des, to have this opportunity today, because disability often doesn't get a good Guernsey, to be honest. It's not always the most, it's confronting. Disability can be very confronting. I have to remind myself of that, because I grew up, my nan was profoundly hearing impaired. So that's just nan, you know, it's just what you're used to. But sometimes disability can be confronting. Yeah, it can be hard to see someone who perhaps may be struggling, but everyone has a right to participate in community, as we know in our communities. And we're really grateful and really keen just to build relationships, take these things to the next step. Paul and Peter and Des, we've been working together for a long time, but we need your voice too. We're not going to make change. Change is just too gradual. The other thing for us is a frustration is, because we grew out of the disability rights movement, we get siloed into that sector. But, you know, we are getting more and more support from our own First Nations sector. But geez, that's taken a long time. But that's kind of typical where disability sits, you know. So, you know, really thank you for the opportunity, and really want to keep working together as closely as we can and see what we can all do together. But yeah, thanks again.
Thanks, Damian. That's great stuff. Really informative. We do have quite a few questions that I noted. Unfortunately, the chat sort of thing moves up, so I've missed the first two. But I did note that someone was saying that Menzies had done some work around epigenetics that might be worth looking at. But I've got a question from John McBain. Will I get John to ask his question? There we go. You're on mute, John, if you're talking.
Yep. Oh, I've got it. Thank you, Peter. And Kaya, everybody. I'm on Noongar country, and our mob are in the Western Pilbara. We say Waiba or Wandewa. So a pleasure to be speaking to you all, and especially listening to Damian. So I'll just read the question off the chat, Damian. One of our committee members, Lois Olney, has an acute case of lymphedema or elephantitis in her lower legs. So every step she takes is a bit like lifting a bucket of concrete. And she's been impacted by being a member of the stolen generation, deaths in custody in her family and all that sort of stuff that's unfortunately so common. And we're both living in Perth. Her experiences with the medical system and NDIS have been inadequate. So with NDIS, it's just taking ages for her to be processed by them. And the second thing, the inappropriateness, because her medical condition is relatively uncommon, I've taken her to hospital on numerous occasions, and because of her legs, she can't wear knickers, so student doctors come in to have a gawk at her legs, and one bloke just got a shot and ran out of the room, leaving her totally exposed, which is just, it's inappropriate whether you're Indigenous or not. And so Loie is an amazing woman and actress, jazz singer, been the subject of several documentaries. And I'm wondering if her story is useful to your movement. And whilst we've been on here, you've prompted me to have a look at the Royal Commission, which sort of slipped under my radar. And I note that there are opportunities at present to input into that. The final thing I want to say, before you get a chance to speak, is the word disability in itself. Loie hates being called disabled. And she, even though she has what we call a disability, and it's probably physical and also partly psychological, she's a very capable person. And I think that's true of many disabled people. And I just cringe every time I use that word. I'll let you have a go now, Damien.
You're on mute, Damien, you're on mute.
Oh, I thought I'd messed up.
No, you're right. Thanks for that. Look, I couldn't agree more with several of the points you made. The NDIS is proving really, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but is proving really problematic, particularly getting assessments. And it's slow, and there's not enough Aboriginal people that work at the National Disability Insurance Agency. There's so many things that are issues there. So I'd be really happy to, perhaps through Paul, I'll provide you my email address and we can talk further, because I do want to see if we can assist very directly with our situation there. But your observations around the failings of the NDIS, we encounter them all the time, and we are over it, quite frankly, and we've been over it for some time. So we need to gather as many voices as we can to critique it. And one of the best ways to do that at the moment is through the Disability Royal Commission. So we do have Commissioner Andrea Mason there, and we lobbied really hard that we needed to have our own commissioner, and she's doing a really good job. I think it'd be great if Anne fell up to it, if she could tell her story to the Royal Commission. I think that would be of great benefit to other people. But there's different ways you can do it. You can do that in private, in closed sessions and all sorts of things. But I think the Royal Commission is one avenue to get some support. But I'd really like to chat with you further, though, because we do have some contacts in Perth too that might be able to sort of, I don't know, agitate a bit or whatever the word is. But because I'd really like to help out if we could. So what I might do is I'll get Paul to send you my email address and we can yarn a bit further. But all those other points you've made, couldn't agree more. And we'd really welcome, I know it's probably a very busy person, but if she wanted to join our organisation, and we'd love to have a board member from WA at the moment. But anyway, I won't put any more pressure on there. But thanks for that. And really, I'll be good to talk next week some more.
So the question from Rosemary was, staff with disability trauma informed on an annual basis, and how do you mob, diffuse and debrief and pre-brief for yourselves? Damn hard work. That's obviously comment, that last bit.
That's also a great question. So like a lot of us and everyone on the call today, this work is really hard, eh? It is really hard to speak up. It's tiring, and it's hard to speak truth to power. The parts of the presentation I gave today, I've been giving for probably 12 or 13 years. The bullet points are no different. And that is probably the most frustrating part that we all face. I think even as members of ANTaR, I mean, you could probably cut and paste something from when you first established in some ways and what's changed. And I think that's the hardest part. I think that's the most traumatic part is change. I don't know that we'll see the change that we want to see necessarily in our lifetime. And I think that's the thing that we probably struggle with the most. We have a very open workplace. Paul's pretty familiar with our workplace. We describe ourselves as a family, actually, and unashamedly. And with that comes some, the tougher elements of being a family, I suppose, too. But no, it's about communicating openly. But yeah, it is hard work, and we do find it hard. And I think everyone on the call today finds this work hard at different times. And we all just have to come together and support each other and get away from it sometimes too. But geez, I've never figured out how you do that, to be honest. But I don't know. I mean, I think we all just sort of, we're very open with each other. We talk a lot as a team, and that helps. Yeah, and there are formal mechanisms you can follow if you need it. But yeah, that's probably how we deal with it.
Thanks. The next question is, to what extent do you feel confident of the Royal Commission outcomes in terms of will they find their way to implementation?
Yeah. So, look, to be honest, there's been that many Royal Commissions, and what change have we seen? I think that's a fair starting point. The difference here, we would say, though, is we're feeling okay. When I say we, the First People's Disability Network, we're feeling okay about how the Royal Commission's going at the moment because we have Andrea Mason there. Now, there's a lot of fair criticism of the Royal Commission at the moment in the disability sector, and I agree with that criticism. There's not enough Australians with disability appearing, telling their stories. But we've had a whole dedicated week this week, and that's just the first. There'll be many other dedicated weeks focusing on the needs of our people with disability. So we're feeling okay in that sense. But hey, these things are only ever as good as the system that's supposed to implement them. We all, and many people on this call more familiar than I am, but the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, we've all been calling for that for a long time now, and there's probably some people on the call today who were involved in that. So it's only ever as good as the people that the system, I suppose. But having said that, we're feeling okay at the moment in the sense that we're getting an opportunity. The other thing that we are finding frustrating, I know the Disability Royal Commission is frustrated also, it's just not being reported in mainstream media. So ABC's on it all the time, SBS on it all the time, NITV's on it all the time. I still haven't seen it reported in the mainstream media. So that shows you still how out of sight disability is, eh? So that's a worry. That's still a worry.
Thanks. So question from Michelle. Would you like to comment on the mental health benefits of caring for country and local food production?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, I think my experience around food security is probably more around, I could probably more comment on food security. So this is a big issue for First Nations people with disability, and we see this play out a lot, when you're in, and Uncle Des would know this better than me, but when it's $9 for a 2-litre bottle of orange juice or something, or you can't get fresh produce, then your health is very seriously impacted. And if you have a pre-existing disability, you can be in a real spot of bother if you can't access traditional food or healthy food. And the unhealthy food is sometimes the most available too, which is a problem. So being able to produce your own food and get around and eat healthily is really critical for First Nations people with disability. It is for anyone, but when you have a disability, you're often very dependent on eating well. And so if you can't do that, then your disability is very, very compromised. And of course, your mental health would be too. So yeah, look, food security, a lot of people on this call would know better, more about food security than I do. But, you know, we see this play out a lot, you know, in regional remote. If you're only on the DSP and then, well, if you're also under the welfare card, if I can say that, basics card, then wow, getting access to good, healthy, nutritious food when you got a pre-existing condition is vital. So.
Thanks, Damian. Any more questions for Damian? Oh, Paul.
Yeah, it's not a Dorothy Dixer, but I did want to look. I've seen yourself, Damian, and Scott. I've been in a lot of meetings with you fellas over the years where, you know, they break. You talked about sort of pigeonholing or stovepiping where you guys sit, and of course you walk in a room and there's the health table and the justice table. And I've observed you and Scott and your people sort of go, well, where do we sit? Because you should be at every table.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of an observation there, and I guess look for your comment more broadly about how you manage, you know, in a space where we talk about social determinants of health, and disability cuts across everything, and it goes to the heart of the experience for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. So I guess an observation from you, I guess from your experience in that and what I've observed of you, having to manage that in this policy space in Australia. And I guess following on from that, I note Joe Ty, our colleague over at the Close the Gap campaign's on today. So hello, Joe. Thinking about the new national agreement on closing the gap, which was signed this year. Again, don't want to talk out of school, and I know that you in behind the scenes, you're in, you know, lots of conversations with your fellow senior Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership and in negotiations with government. But clearly, you know, we hope that this agreement is a positive step forward. It doesn't have everything, and in fact, there's not a lot of detail really, and I know a lot of it's to come. But what's the best case scenario out of that agreement for addressing and supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with disability going forward? Thanks, mate. And sorry, that's a lot, but whatever you can answer.
No worries. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, as you know, we often talk about the fact that we actually say at the First Peoples Disability Network, our members have to walk in three worlds. So they have to be in the disability rights sector, they have to be in the First Nations rights sector, and then the everyone else sector, if you like. And the weird thing for us is well, governments silo us. So we actually grew out of the disability rights movement. We didn't grow out of the First Nations rights movement. That's just because of the way we were funded, to be honest. Yet we cross over. So our members would say we're First Nations people and we're people with disability. So that confuses the system. They don't know where to put us. So that's an ongoing battle, and like you say, you know, it's a frustrating one a lot of the time. So we've been very critical of closing the gap, not talking school out of school there. I was only reflecting the other day that Uncle Lester and I went to the first, I think it was the first Closing the Gap gathering at Eagle Hawk Resort outside Canberra 12 years ago or something, or 10 years ago or something like that. And we were asked to do a talk on disability and no one came to it. So I don't think it's because we're poor. I mean, Uncle Lester can attract a crowd. He used to be able to attract a crowd. So I don't think it was performance. I don't think it wasn't because it was going to be dull and boring. I hope not anyway. But that's typical where disability sits, you know. It's just people find it hard, I think. And so that's been our challenge ever since, is to get voices heard. Now, having said that, just before we did this forum today, I was on a good call actually about, so disability has been identified as a priority area for capacity building. So that's really good. And I think that means we will get a seat at the table now. But what I don't want people to think is we're new kids on the block. We've actually been around for a long time. It's just that the system hasn't listened to us. So it's not like we're new. We're not new. We've been here for a long time. So, and look, that feels more positive. So I think it will mean that there'll be potential for the social movement of First Nations people with disability to grow, because you have to have the person with disability, the First Nations person with disability has to be the voice in the room. So the person, I've been in disability since I left school and family and stuff, but I'm still learning. I saw deaf-blind communication for the first time the other day, and that was truly amazing to watch. You know, these are people that don't see and don't hear, and then they sign language by touching on the arms and stuff. It was just like the coolest thing, and I hadn't seen that before. So, you know, it's a complex area, and people have to be able to speak for themselves. Like the blind man has to be able to speak for himself. I mean, I know that sounds so obvious, but, you know, we could close our eyes for 10 minutes and might have an idea for 10 minutes, but we don't really understand what it's like to be without vision, for example. So that's what we need to change, is getting those voices heard. But look, we're feeling a little bit better about it now, to be honest. And that is probably a different place to where I was probably 12 months ago, to be honest, Paul. Still will be annoyed by it at different times, I'm sure, but no, it's getting there, starting off.
Thanks. And last question, I think, from Rosemary. What are 3 things that you think could be adopted by services tomorrow to ease the burden for mob?
Wow. Geez, that's a good question. My first reaction is, I don't know why I'm thinking that way, the government. My first reaction, we need government to get out of the way, but I don't think that's what you're suggesting there. But wow. So I'm going to take this from a perspective of disability services. So maybe what they need to do is get to know their local community, but also I'd argue we need to create our own First Nations owned and operated disability service system. It doesn't exist in Australia. I could think of 4 or 5 really great community organisations that are owned by First Nations mob, and they do a great job, but it's very rare. So we need to build our own service system. We need to build our own workforce. And we also need to build the social movement, continue to build the social movement of First Nations people with disability. That'd be the 3 things I'd say, yeah.
Thanks. And okay, this is the last question, I think. How could ANTaR support First People's Disability Network? So what more can we do?
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
I guess that's not only, you know, how much more work can we get Paul to do, but actually how much more work can we get the state and territory ANTARs to do as well?
Yeah, I think, you know, and Paul and I have talked about this a lot over the years, and I wonder if given that there's going to be a little bit more capacity coming into FPDN, I wonder if we can start working more closely together. Actually, not that we don't work together, but in the sense of, I think we need your voices too. So often as everyone would know, like often what government does is they'll say back to us, well, you fellas would say that, you know what I mean? Because, you know, because of who we're representing. But I think it'd be really great if ANTaR could get behind reforming the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So it's actually meaningful for our people with disability. I'm sure there's loads of people on the panel, on the webinar today that have had big problems with the NDIS. I would be very surprised if there isn't. So we would benefit from, because the NDIA is, if I may say so, and this might get me in trouble, but is a fairly arrogant organisation, to be honest, and it operating more and more like a Centrelink kind of thing. We actually need to get some humanity back into that agency, and I really would love to be able to work. We get battered back with that because we would say what we say, if you get my drift, but if we had other voices there, I think it'd be really good. I think we also need ANTaR to, it's funny, we had this chat in the office last week about, so we did this thing in Taree last week. We do community events all the time, you know, and I'm not telling anyone on the call that doesn't experience these things, but you know, there was so much anger and so much pain. How can we actually start campaigning and protesting? Actually, we got back to protest, to be honest, particularly around police interactions with, you know, I mean, all these things we all know. But yeah, I kind of wonder about protest, to be honest. It's not very sophisticated. It needs a lot more thinking than that. But I kind of sometimes feel we've got to go back to that world. I think at the moment, I don't know. But anyway, maybe that's just how I'm feeling today. But definitely the NDIS stuff would be brilliant to work on.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. And yeah, I think it's very easy to get complacent in the advocacy field, you know, having nice meetings with ministers and stuff, and then getting trapped that we're getting somewhere. But you might be right in terms of something a bit more action driven, something a bit more protesty. I mean, and in terms of ANTaR's role, I mean, really that's why we were formed was the National Indigenous Working Group basically said, we need you white fellas to actually push our case so that it's not about our self-interest, it's actually about some broader national understanding. And obviously we should be doing that in every field. Yeah. So yeah, thanks very much, Damian. Things keep coming up. So there's some lovely comments in the chat if you want to have a read of that. But yeah, thanks very much, Damian. Yeah, what you've been saying is spot on and inspired, and yeah, let's keep working together. So I might now move quickly to Paul to give a bit of an overview of the year for ANTaR while we've been basically zooming around. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, particularly thanks to Damian. Really loved hearing from you again, mate. It's a real honour for us. And yeah, great questions from everybody that's zoomed in today. We've recorded today, so we'll be sharing that. We'll pass that on to Lisa and the others at your team over there at FPDN to be using as you see fit as well. But yeah, really appreciate it. And I'm sure as Peter indicated, you know, on behalf of ANTaR and our board that Des is on as well, we really do stand with you in solidarity, and we'll do all we can. Just all you have to do is ask. And even if you aren't asking, we'll be pestering you for what more we can do. So thank you, mate. Yeah, I thought I'll keep it really brief. I know Damian needs to leave pretty soon as well, but just wanted to give a really quick rundown just of some of the key highlights from 2020 for ANTaR. It feels like we've been saying this ad nauseum all year, but it's been a crazy year, hasn't it? And it's been an interesting one. As we've heard from Damian, we've had the Disability Royal Commission. We started off the year with crazy, I'm going to use that word a lot, intense historical intensity bushfires, which had an outsized impact on First Nations communities up and down the eastern seaboard. And then we went into lockdown. Again, a great news story, a great story of resilience is that it's been well documented that First Nations communities, led by their health leaders, community-controlled health, and their national leadership, they actually handled the lockdown and avoiding the worst impacts of COVID-19 in their communities. They were protecting themselves better than we were at large in the general population. So that's a real credit to their, I guess, their experience, their community resilience, and yeah. So that's been a good news story in a difficult situation, and it's been recognised internationally as well. We saw, and we were going to hear from Jamie Lowe today, and unfortunately, as we noted, he couldn't join us, and we wish him well. And we've been working closely with Jamie Lowe and the National Native Title Council and the University of Melbourne on the treaty conversation. We had to postpone the gathering of the National Treaty Summit, which was intended for April this year down in Melbourne. And we've been working behind the scenes to hopefully create the National Summit next year. But in the interim, what we've been doing is with our partners at the National Native Title Council and the University of Melbourne have been hosting a series of treaty webinars. I think we've had about 4 or 5 so far, and we've got a final one, which I think Pete might give a little plug to at the end, coming up in a couple of weeks. So they've been a really good opportunity to bring people together. We live in the Zoom world or Microsoft Meets or whatever online video teleconferencing systems we've been using, we've been able to actually in greater numbers come together and talk about these really important issues. So it's been a great interim project for us to pull together those treaty webinars. And there's a lot of material, content and wisdom that's been shared that we'll be able to keep drawing from and sharing over the coming months and years as we push for that treaty conversation and inevitably, I think, a framework of treaties across Australia and completing that unfinished business that's been hanging around since 1788. I think I was making some notes earlier today just about a couple of things that I'd highlight. So we've had a strategic plan in place from last year that goes for 3 years. I'll just share it in the chat, the link to that for people to note. But the 4 things that we've got as strategic goals are that we want to be an organisation that where did my notes go? That leads the conversation. We want to be part of the conversation, but we also want to be leading those opportunities to platform conversations around treaty, around disability, around heritage protection and the like. So you can see in those treaty webinars, so that's how we've been trying to work to that goal this year. We also, where'd it go? Hang on, I'll draw it up here. Disappeared. I wrote notes and then it disappeared. Okay, to educate is the second one. Apologies. We want to be an organisation that contributes to the education of our communities and our society at large. And we've been doing that through a number of means. We're getting more and more active in the policy space. So we're providing submissions to things like bushfire inquiries, to the nationhood inquiry late last year. We put in a submission into the Disability Royal Commission, and all of the things that we were saying was backing in the advocacy work of First Peoples Disability Network and our other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander partners working in that space. Native title inquiries and many other inquiries. We're getting more and more active in providing policy work that contributes to those conversations and then sharing that information across our networks. We've had a blog in place for the last couple of years featuring a number of our board members like Des and Jackie and Peter, but also we've had many guest bloggers over the years talking about a whole range of issues from closing the gap, disability, native title, treaty, and many other issues and topics of note. So we've been sharing a lot of that work. The third thing is that we want to be building a network that does the kind of activity that Damian was asking of us. And as Peter noted, the genesis of ANTaR was that it was a people's movement built in protest at the inequity and inequality of the positions taken by, I think, the Howard government at the time of our formation. And ever since, we've been a strong network that stands alongside our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters and friends and family and colleagues. And we're continuing to build that network. And it's actually been one of the upsides of this year is that we've had a very strong and committed generation of supporters that have been there since day one, and they continue to be amazing supporters, both financially and in their work and activity and volunteering here with us at ANTaR. We've got a great volunteer team, and I can see a number of them on the Zoom today, which is great. But this year we've seen a big uptick in sort of the newer, younger generations coming in and really taking hold of the issues and wanting to be engaged and wanting to participate and make a contribution. We've got a couple of internship programs here at ANTaR National, which have been a great way of incorporating young university students and master's students that want to do something. So we're bringing in a couple of students every quarter or every 6 months and putting them on some really useful projects and then drawing in their communities and networks and through social media and the like. And in fact, the Black Lives Matter movement, which I guess re-energized with the tragedy around the death of Floyd, in America in, I think it was May, and also the Jukin Caves destruction. We had a big uptick in new generations wanting to get involved and see how they could participate and contribute financially and otherwise. So that's been really good. And then finally, the fourth strategic goal is to be an effective organisation. And I've been working closely with the board in the 2.5 years that I've been at ANTaR around reforming how we operate and the things that we focus on, lifting our capabilities and our capacities, particularly in a thought leader model of organisation. So we're always looking to lift our capacity to contribute to the big policy discussions that impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So that's been a real positive this year as well. So there's been plenty more that I could talk about. I really wanted to keep it brief. But yeah, just wanted to thank everybody for their support, and particular thanks to Peter and noting Des is the other board rep on with me today. Des and the board, I can see Shay and Jill and Darren and others from the board have joined us today on Zoom. It's been, I know the team feels really supported by the board and their commitment. So anyway, that's it. Thank you. It's been a good year and we're looking forward to 2021. So back over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Paul. And yeah, obviously on behalf of the board, we want to say that despite the troubles of the virus, and somehow the staff and led by Paul have done a magnificent job this year in terms of our achievements and what we've done, and keeping things going and living in the Zoom world. And hopefully we'll be meeting more often face to face, even if we have a large pole between people when we meet. But yeah, no, really appreciate the way staff have managed this difficult year, and also the fact that we've actually been able to achieve things. So thanks very much for that, Paul and Michael, and any other staff member who's listening in. So we might draw today to a close. So firstly, I do want to remind people of the webinar that's happening on the 9th of December. On part of our treaty series, so featuring Jamie Lowe, Mick Dodson, Mick Gooder, Jackie Huggins, Ursula Raymond, and Ruben Berg, and they'll be talking about the status of treaty in the various states and territories. This has been, as I think someone's mentioned, this has been recorded. I can see the red light flashing, so that means it's working. So you'll be able to see this later, and of course for ANTaR members. We have the rest of the forum, which is for ANTaR members and state and territory ANTARs, starting at 11 o'clock tomorrow. And I guess we'll see you all then. Anything I've missed, Paul?
I think you've covered it. Thanks, Pete. Thanks again, Damian. Thanks, Des. And
thanks again, Damian and Des. Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
So thanks, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and talk to you later. All righty. Cheers.
Thanks. See you, everybody.
Bye.